Yang berbahagia, Professor Datuk Dr. Abdullah Muhammad Said, Deputy Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, University Technology Mara, Malaysia. Mr. Zulkifli bin Haji Sharif, Chief. I apologize. And Encik Ahmed Faris Amir, Convener for UT Mara Australs 2013. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and good evening. Yang berbahagia Datuk Saifuddin bin Abdullah, Patron MIDP. Yang berbahagia Professor Datuk Dr. Abdullah Muhammad Said, Deputy Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, University Technology Mara, Malaysia. Yang berusaha Dr. Bahrain bin Uthman. And Yang berusaha Encik Ahmed Faris Amir, Convener for UT Mara Australs 2013. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Grand Finals for the UT Mara Australs 2013. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite you to stand up for the Malaysian National Anthem, Negaraku. Thank you, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would now like to invite you to take your seats. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite Muayyad Khairul Marini to lead the recitation of prayers to begin today's program.
A'udzu billahi minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Al-Fatihah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammadin ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. O Allah, on this glorious evening, in conjunction with the grand finals of UT Mara Australs 2013, we thank you for gathering us in good health, and we uphold our hands to pray gratefully to thank on your infinite favor and your blessing to make this occasion a success. You are the mercy of mercies, you are the Lord of the universe. Give us mercy from your presence and shape for us right conduct in our plight. We ask you for knowledge which is beneficial and sustenance that is good and deeds which are acceptable. O Allah, help us remember you, thank you, and worship you in the best of manners. Forgive us for all our sins and have mercy upon us and guide us onto the right path. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasana wa qina azaban nar wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Thank you, Muayyad, for that prayer recitation. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, For the last few days, the best debaters from all across the Australasian region have gathered here in Kuala Lumpur to debate on a multitude of issues. Tonight, we are here to witness the top 2 teams that emerged out of the 123 teams that participated in this year's Australs in the grand finals that will begin shortly. You've been listening to my voice a lot for the past 3 nights, so now I will pass this on to Tariq Mektab, Chief Adjudicator for Austral 2013, who will be chairing the grand finals, and who will be introducing the competing teams for tonight.
Good evening. On the affirmative team, we have Victoria University of Wellington 1, speaking first will be Asher Emmanuel. Second is Jody O'Neill. Third affirmative speaker is Nick Cross. While reply will be done by Asher Emmanuel. On site negative, we have University of Sydney Union 2. Speaking first is Paul Karp. The second speaker for the negative is Nina Ubaldi. And the third speaker is Daniel Swain. The reply will be done by Paul Karp. Before we start the debate, let me remind the audience of the rules. There'll be 8-minute speeches, no POIs. There will be a bell at 6 minutes and 8 minutes for the substantive speeches, and there will be a bell at 3 minutes and 4 minutes for the reply speeches. Let me also remind the House to turn off or silent your handphones, to only enter or exit the hall in between speeches, and to lower, I understand you guys have a lot of support for your teams, but it'd be nice if we could hear them during their speech. Right. Let me reintroduce the adjudicators in today's panel. In this panel, from the AJCOR is Tasneem Ilyas. And Imran Rahim. Corinne Marty from Auckland. Madeline Schultz from Monash. Carlo Cabrera of the London School of Economics. Monique Harding of Melbourne. And last but not least, Arina Najwa of International Islamic University, Malaysia. The motion that stands before the House is that women should be criminally liable for harms inflicted upon their fetuses in utero as a result of their lifestyle choices. Teams are on their way. Let's give a round of applause for the two finalists. Okay, I'm looking one of the teams. Right, let's get this debate rolling. Start the debate for the day. We'd like to invite the first speaker of the Affirmative, Mr. Asher Emmanuel.
An unborn child, Mr. Speaker, is not a person, but it will be a person. And if, while you are caring for that child in your body, you choose to smoke, you choose to drink, that child will likely suffer serious disadvantage into its life. We're talking about learning impairments, we're talking about physical disabilities. You are, through those choices, those free choices, condemning that child to a more difficult life than they would otherwise have to suffer. And it's a massive difficulty in many developed countries right now, the amount of fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a result of a relatively rampant alcohol industry, a relatively rampant tobacco industry. On the side of the House, we believe that current systems of warning people, of telling people that it's not a good idea, the tiny logo that you see on the back of the can of beer has not been enough, and that's why we stand for criminal punishment. What we're going to do on this side of the House is apply criminal sanctions, what we think to be society's highest condemnation of certain actions. We don't think jail is appropriate, we don't think fines are appropriate, we support community-based punishments and mandatory rehabilitation. But the focus for the efficacy of this case is on the effect of a criminal sanction on the way in which people make their decisions. Naturally, because we want to reduce the number of people who have to suffer these kind of dysfunctions, we want to complement criminal sanctions with preemptive measures, strong awareness campaigns, and well-funded support for rehabilitation. 4 substantive points from this side of the House. Firstly, I'm going to be undertaking a rights analysis and comparing the vulnerability of the unborn person with the decisions made by a mother. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the efficacy of the criminal law in changing an individual's decision-making calculus. And thirdly, we're going to be talking about how this changes a culture such that there's greater community intervention in situations where somebody is making a choice which affects not simply them, but somebody who is yet to live. Jody at second is going to tell you how the industry is going to respond to this kind of system. Let's talk first then about the vulnerability of the child. And we accept that an unborn person does not yet bear full rights, but they do bear some, insofar as they are very likely to come into existence and suffer the defects as a result of a choice of another person. It might seem obvious to say, Mr. Speaker, but the person inside the womb makes no decision. They are not permitted the choice to decide whether or not they are going to trade off their short-term pleasure against long-term impairment for themselves. Only one person is invested with that choice, and that is the mother. We think somebody who's vulnerable in those circumstances is deserving of all of the protection which we can grant them. Let's then compare that with the rights of an individual to consume. We think the general principle on this side of the House is that so far as your consumption harms only yourself, that's entirely fine. You want to drink, you want to smoke, go right ahead. At the extent to which that starts to harm other people, that becomes somewhat less okay. We think to the extent that the baby is dependent on the mother, that is deserving of support. We don't think that this is all inconsistent with our existing principles of law surrounding the relationship between parents and children. We have extensive protection in terms of negligent parenting. Let's explore that a little bit more. Guardianship is the concept of the relationship between the parent and child, not ownership. You don't have absolute, full, unfettered rights to decide what you do with a child or how you affect that child in life. We acknowledge in our law already that if you fall below the community standards for the treatment of another person who is in your care, the community will intervene to protect that person. If you do not give them the medical attention that they deserve, the community will intervene. If you do not feed them, the community will intervene, Mr. Speaker. The same must apply here. If you fail to meet the community standards by effectively poisoning an unborn child, the community will intervene. Finally, it's quite obvious, but you are simply inflicting a harm on another person. Were that person outside your womb and you were doing this kind of effective poisoning to them, that's the kind of thing that the criminal law would already sanction right now. We think simply because the person is inside the womb and they're going to come about doesn't mean that they shouldn't be deserving of that same protection, given that causal nexus is sufficiently close to say that's almost an unavoidable reality. Let's talk then in the second substantive point about the efficacy of criminal law and changing the way in which individuals make decisions. As I said in my introduction, we consider this to be society's greatest sanction. It is the state prosecuting on behalf of the community and saying that somebody has fallen below the expected standards of conduct. We think that that carries a very powerful message as to what is right and wrong behavior, what the community condemns and what the community condones. Right now, we condone this behavior by saying that a warning label is sufficient to protect somebody who is unable to protect themselves. The point at which we begin to condemn this behavior, we think that has a powerful signaling effect. Moreover, it's more powerful than the way in which criminal sanctions affect other things to do with addiction, right? It's implausible that you might be caught with some illegal substances, right? But it's almost certain that you are going to be found out if you severely poison their child and they have developmental difficulties after that fact, which means the likelihood of the sanction being applied to you is very, very high, which makes it all the more effective in changing the way in which somebody makes their decisions. We think this means two things. Firstly, somebody is quite simply less likely to fall on the side of deciding to drink rather than deciding not to drink in more marginal cases. Secondly, we think it makes it far more likely that somebody is likely to actually go out and seek assistance in ending an addiction with which they are struggling. It changes the way in which those incentives operate. This law communicates that the choice that this person is making is not one that affects simply themselves, but that it affects another person as well. That's more effective than a warning label, Mr. Speaker. Now I move on to the third substantive point, and this is what we consider to perhaps be the most important part of the way in which this is going to change people's behavior. Individuals do not operate inside a vacuum. Our moral codes are not formed endogenously by ourselves. They are very much affected by the way in which other people think about what is appropriate behavior and what is inappropriate behavior. What that means is what the community believes is important to what you think you should do, which means if the community condones what you are doing in their tacit acceptance of your behavior, when they pass you another drink, when they sell you a drink, when they sell you that packet of cigarettes at the dairy, when you are patently pregnant, Mr. Speaker, that says what you are doing is okay. This law starts to change that. How does that happen? We think that individuals themselves are generally weak, and addiction is something which is very difficult to overcome. So it's all the more easy to challenge those kind of difficulties when you have other people to support you. This law changes views. I'm proud to come from a country which, a couple of years ago, criminalized the use of physical violence against children for the purposes of correction. The time at which that law was passed, it was wildly unpopular. In fact, there was a referendum which was held against it that showed that 80% of people believed that it was okay to use violence against your child for the purposes of good parenting. That's changed, though, Mr. Speaker, over the last 5 years. Why? Because sometimes our institutions need to be aspirational as to what the community's moral code should be. That we should not stand by and rely on simple social sanctions without the backing of the state to say, this is what we should aim for, rather than that we accept your conduct at that time. The majority now believes that it's okay to beat people who are vulnerable in order to correct their behavior. And that has an effect on the way in which people in the community look at other people who do that to their children. What we think is that when you start to change those norms by saying that the law ought be this and people ought live up to that standard, is that you encourage others in the community, your friends and your family, to say, no, you shouldn't have that other drink. No, you should go to rehab at this point in time, because that choice you are making affects not simply yourself, Mr. Speaker. We think when you start to establish those norms and change those norms, that's when you allow people to make those difficult decisions and overcome those challenges, like being addicted to drugs or alcohol. The unborn child is, of course, not a person, but it's going to be one, Mr. Speaker. If you mistreat it in this way, it's going to be disadvantaged, and you're going to do a disservice to your child. This side of the House, however, is not going to stand by after the fact and say, we didn't think we should try. We propose.
Thank you, Asher. I would like to invite the first speaker of the negative team, Paul Karp.
The main problem with that speech was that the first affirmative never showed that the assertion that being, the suboptimal condition that you might inherit in utero from the lifestyle choices of your mother was sufficiently bad enough to attach a criminal sanction to. Because there are lots of things that parents might do with respect to raising their children that are suboptimal, like allowing them to eat too much food and be obese, that we say wouldn't meet the standard of making it a crime. This is particularly relevant when you consider the fact that in order to stop this person being born and that harm accruing to a real person, this model creates a perverse incentive to abort your fetus to make sure that they never come into existence. That is perverse. Two issues in rebuttal. Firstly, balance of rights. Secondly, the effectiveness of this. Firstly, on the balance of rights, they said the fetus is not making the choice to have this done to them. But nor do fetuses choose to be born either. So by that logic, you would hold parents responsible for the disabilities that their children have by the virtue of being born, not by things done to them in utero. Like if they have a genetic condition, then the parents were negligent in not aborting that child because they've now condemned them to a life of having a disability for that reason. The next thing he said is that we don't have unfettered rights over our children. We don't allow, we don't allow you to abuse them by not feeding them or whatever. The difference is that under the status quo, we have a clear test where you have to be a legal person at the time that harm accrues. At the point that negligent intention was there has to be a real person to whom that has happened to. Under your model, that's only a potential that fetus will become a person in the future. And like Asher never proved that the fetus was definitely going to be born. Anything could happen in the meantime. There could be a miscarriage. That person's rights could never crystallize. In fact, we think it's very likely that its rights will never crystallize because mothers will just go out and get an abortion whenever there's any kind of genetic defect in their child that might be attributed to them because of your eugenic model that says that they have to do everything in their power to make sure that these children are as genetically as perfect as possible. Lastly, in this rights issue, we think it was telling that the first affirmative didn't address the obvious analogy in this debate to abortion. That while he said society's standard for what you do to your fetus is applicable for what harm you might cause it if it then becomes a life, why that logic didn't extend to whether or not society could choose to control women's bodies by preventing them even getting an abortion in the first place. Second issue in rebuttal then is the effect of this model. We heard it would change behavior. First of all, we don't think that women are as callous with their bodies as the first affirmative would make out. They don't drink and smoke that much. Societal pressure is very high. The people that do then engage in that behavior, we think do that because they have an addiction. And we don't think that given neglect laws under the status quo stop parents from harming children that have actually been born, that your model will do very much good given that they are still in utero. Lastly, we would point out that this model is going to be incredibly difficult to prove. How will you ever show that the standard beyond a reasonable doubt that it was it was what was done by the mother rather than any other genetic factor that is going to be particularly hard for you in this debate. We accept that you can have information campaigns and all the rest of it. Most of the rest of the first affirmative material about changing the way the community would see these things was largely contingent. What are we going to tell you in our case? We think that either this is not suboptimal parenting because fetuses are not yet lives, or that it is suboptimal parents, but not to the state of it being abusive, that deserving criminal sanction. And that lastly, criminal sanction is incredibly counterproductive. So what we would allow in our case is no criminal or civil liability for a mother doing what she wants with her own body, with bodily autonomy. If other people harm a fetus, then that could possibly be grievous bodily harm based to the woman, but not to the fetus. What will I bring you in case? Firstly, why there's no crime against the fetus. Secondly, bodily autonomy. And thirdly, the harm of a criminal sanction. So firstly, to why there is no crime against the fetus. We'd say that there are very strong reasons to think that it's not life. That's actually a bit conceded in this debate. That it's incredibly dependent on the woman and that it doesn't really have brain function at this stage. So it's not a life at the moment. This is something that they have to peg to a future right that crystallizes. So the second thing in this argument here here is to note that there are huge benefits to the child being born, and that this model, if you would charge them criminally for the consequence of that child being born, creates a perverse incentive to not report any of the genetic damage, not to get that tested, but to just go ahead to do it in private, and then to abort in private also, to prevent the harm crystallizing that allows them to justify their control over women's bodies. What we must do in this debate then is compare the potential disability that a fetus might suffer if it were born with the fact that without the mother's ongoing labor and sacrifice and commitment to that fetus, that child will never be born at all. So the affirmative can call this fetus's life suboptimal, uphill and down dale. They will never prove that that is worse than not existing, because that is the consequence of their model, that people will just rush out and abort as a result of it. Second argument I want to look at is about bodily autonomy, because everything a woman does to her body could potentially, incidentally affect the health of a fetus. It could be not taking hormones or vitamins. It could be wanting a water birth, or whether you take drugs for pain at birth, whether or not you exercise during pregnancy, whether you delay inducement, or whether you get a C-section. We would ask the affirmative where they're going to draw the line for this criminal responsibility. We think it's fundamentally arbitrary, because this societal standards could justify a level of perfection that would override the bodily autonomy of the woman and insist that they carry it to the absolute highest standard, even when that is not required for the child to have a good and meaningful life. Because what they weren't able to show in this debate was that while fetal alcohol syndrome is particularly suboptimal, why you couldn't use that logic to extend it further than that for every kind of benefit that they want for this child, even to the extent that it means sacrificing the ability for women to do what they want with their own bodies. We say it's fundamentally unfair, either because it will stop women doing very small things that are unlikely to cause harm, like drinking occasionally, or because these women are heavily addicted and don't have a lot of agency in whether or not they continue to smoke or drink. We think the state is overstepping its social interest in women's bodies and prescribing what they can do to too high a degree. Last argument I want to look at is about the harm of criminal sanction, because we want to ask what penalty will be imposed on women in this debate. If it is a low penalty that is imposed on them, less than you would for harming a person in this way, we think that's fundamentally, that would be fundamentally contradictory. That would be saying that life, when it comes into existence, is worth less as a result of that being a future potential life than someone who is currently existing. If it is a very severe penalty that they impose in this debate, such as things that would actually convince people to change their behavior, that will have incredibly high harms. It will be severe psychological harm to that child to know that they were responsible for that criminal sanction to their parents, such as imprisonment. It will mean that that child won't be raised by that parent if they go to prison. And that will have a huge harm on the vulnerable women themselves, who are addicted, who didn't have the best agency to prevent that harm accruing to a future life, and who are going to be subjected to something like a prison sentence. The effects of this model are a few. Firstly, women will be less likely to go to a doctor, both for their initial addiction, because that will provide evidence that will then be used to charge them, but also if there's a complication in their pregnancy. Because if they suspect that complication is due to their own actions, then they would rather bleed out and take their chances bleeding there rather than risk going to prison under their model. What would the affirmative team do if someone attempted to abort their child and failed and was sitting there bleeding out? We don't think that this is something they're ever going to prove, and that women are going to be harmed as a result of this high criminal sanction. So because we don't think that the suboptimality of a potential life justifies ruining the lives of the mother, we beg to oppose.
Thank you, Paul. I would like to invite the second speaker of the affirmative, Jody O'Neill.
Mr. Speaker, just because there are a lot of ways in which you can harm a child, maybe you can harm it by having a water birth, maybe you can harm it in lots of different ways. The problem is, when we've stood up and told you on our side of the house that there is a type of way that actively harms your child, that we know actively harms your child, that you know is actively going to harm your child, we think that's very different to say that we're going to apply a criminal sanction to that. And that's why their analysis and their alarmism that they had on that side of the house just wasn't up to standard. 4 things that I want to talk about in rebuttal before I go on to tell you about why exactly we're going to change the incentives that act on corporations and why it's going to be in their best interest to try and discourage women from doing this because it damages their own reputation. Firstly, I want to talk about the model that we set out for you and why exactly we think that this does meet the standard in terms of the criminal sanction. Because they wanted to tell you a lot of things about rights of people versus rights of children. Because the thing is, we wanted to agree with them from the very start of this debate that this is not a life that we're talking about here, right, Mr. Speaker? The problem is that we gave you a number of pieces of analysis as Asher that they fundamentally ignored. The first thing to say here is that we told you that there are certain responsibilities that come along with having something that is essentially dependent on you as a person. And we think that when he said that their response to that on that side of the house was to say, oh, well, people don't choose to be born, right? So if you're born and you're disabled, well, then maybe we should punish your parents for simply the choice to have you be born. The difference here is that we think there's a problem of causation, right? You are the person that caused that child to be born with that harm. You knew that that dependency existed. You chose for that child to be born. We think that that's something that you should be held causally responsible for. The second thing to say here is they wanted to say that this child may never become a person. But we think the important thing is, it is your intention that they become a person. As the mother, you know that you intend to take that child to term. You intend for it to be a person. It doesn't matter whether those rights are with it at the time that you choose to make that action. The point is that it will have those rights in the future, and you know about that. We think that's very different to an issue of foreseeability, that just generally in the law, why we don't think those kinds of people are persons, because the mother has that kind of information. The final thing to say is that we think that these people have knowledge that they're acting in this way, and we think they have knowledge that they're acting in a way that is going to constrain the rights of a person into the future. It's going to change their ability to be able to access certain types of things. And that was why it was just offensive when they told you on that side of the house that it doesn't meet the standard for the criminal sanction, Mr. Speaker, because we think that making a baby that is fundamentally born with limited intellectual capacity, that sometimes has deformed limbs, is something that really does affect that child's quality of life into the future, and we're just not happy to say that that doesn't meet the criminal sanction. Bodily autonomy, should we care about it? Because the first thing to say here is that they just wanted to have all this alarmism. Where do we draw the line? Maybe we'll impose on women's choices all the time in the future. We think we draw the line where it's clear that there is a harm. Next thing is that to say we think that a lot of the time your choices are constrained by choices that you made in the past, right? The fact that you are pregnant inherently constrains some of your choices, right? And we think that this is just another way in which a choice that you made in the past to become pregnant in the first place constrains your choices into the future. We think that's perfectly in line with bodily autonomy because we think that that's how it works, Mr. Speaker. The final thing to say is in terms of the efficacy of our model. First thing they wanted to talk about was, reasonable doubt, Mr. Speaker. We think that it's going to be really hard to prove. Okay, so maybe in cases where it's really clear that the baby has fetal alcohol syndrome, because we think we're pretty good at recognizing when that happens, that we're going to be able to prove that. In all of the rest of the cases, we're not going to be able to prove that, but that's where our signaling mechanism comes in, which Asher gave you a lot of analysis about, that they decided that they just weren't going to respond to. Final point in terms of this is, will they get an abortion, right? Because we thought it was a really bizarre harm on their side of the house when they wanted to say it's not a life, but we're really worried about abortions, Mr. Speaker. That's simply incoherent. What we want to say is that we're not worried about life in and of itself. It's not a life. What we're worried about is quality of life when that thing becomes a person. That's the thing that we want to worry about on our side of the house. So, how does the efficacy of our model work? the first thing that we told you is that we think that they are far less likely to drink. And even dealing with the problems that they wanted to talk about addiction on that side of the house is we think that they're far more likely to get community help. And that's why it's really bad that they never responded to Ash's analysis about community help, because we wanted to tell you this changes the way that individuals act within society. It changes the way that their friends and neighbours act towards them, and it changes the incentives on them to do things like get help and like to have other people refuse to sell them things like drinks and cigarettes. Their only response to this was to say, oh, well, people are going to go and bleed out, Mr. Speaker, because they are scared of our punishment, which was community sentencing, right? That's just ludicrous. Why would someone risk their life instead of going to like mandatory drug or alcohol rehabilitation? We think that that was just ridiculous. So what do we think is actually going to happen? We think these people are going to get far better community help, and that's really important. So, why do we think this changes the incentives that act on corporations, and why will they act more responsibly? Because we think corporations, particularly those that are associated with drugs and alcohol, are really careful about their image. We think it's really embarrassing for them when, like, pregnant women are shown on television drinking, and society views that as something that's very harmful. So we think we have two mechanisms to change that. The first is that we think we get a far lot more media attention and a far lot more awareness about these kinds of issues. But we think that media attention is far more targeted, right? Because we think it's something that has a harm to a young child, right? And we think that's really, really embarrassing for them because that's a baby and nobody wants to see babies born with like half arms, right, Mr. Speaker? The next thing to say is that we think that particularly in trials and the like, there's a lot of community soul searching for who the person is that we should blame for this. And we think at the moment, what alcohol and cigarette companies do is they run the line of choice, choice, choice. People are choosing to smoke, people are choosing to drink. But we think this undermines that narrative, right? Because the baby is not choosing. We think that undermines all of that rhetoric. So what is their response to this? We think firstly, they're going to be very active in pushing kind of awareness campaigns, in saying that women shouldn't drink, in labeling on packaging in a far more prominent way than they do at the moment. And we think that the final thing that they're going to do is they're going to do things like force retailers not to sell, like refuse to sponsor public events that allow pregnant women to get drunk. We think all of those things buy into the signaling mechanism that we wanted to talk about, that change the way that people view the way that pregnant women are drinking. So it may not be that we can like take every single pregnant woman to trial, but it just means that the community itself changes the way that we view pregnant women and changes the way that we think about those kinds of actions. And we think that aligning corporate incentives with that is a really great way, because currently they're one of the things that continues to run the line of choice and run the line that this is women's bodily autonomy. It's not. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't matter that the baby is not alive. It's something that's worth protecting. The woman knows it's going to one day become a child. That's important. We propose.
Thanks, Jody. I'd like to invite second speaker of the negating team, Nina Ubaldi.
When Louisiana instituted laws exactly like this, it saw a 14-year-old crack addict charged with the damage to her child. It saw similar laws where women who tried to commit suicide were charged with the damage to their children. This is a policy that targets the most vulnerable women in the name of saying that the state has control over your body the moment that body happens to be carrying a fetus. We're concerned here not just with the principle that the state doesn't own you because you're carrying something inside you, but also for the women in this debate. Because if you cared about lives, the lives of the women who you were harming here were just as important, if not more, in this debate. So I'm firstly going to deal in my rebuttal with the level of the control the state has because your body is containing a fetus. Then I'm going to be telling you what this does for the women in this debate. My own material today is about the perceptions and support this gives to children with disabilities, how this harms them even more in this debate. My second argument is about how this leads to unfair and arbitrary punishment on the basis of sensitivity periods to particular chemicals. So firstly, to the level of control the state has over your body. These guys wanted to consistently analogize it to a standard parent-child relationship after the baby was born. But we knew that wasn't the case, because the key difference here was the rights of the mother and the rights of the child were coming into direct conflict. This was a competition that never existed after that child was born. So what then was the difference? Because here, these guys wanted to accept that you had a right to abortion. Quite clearly, they thought the relationship was different because you didn't have the right to terminate the life of your baby after they had been born. So what does this actually show you? It shows you that where a woman does not have an obligation to bring a baby to life, where the absolute existence of that baby is contingent on the woman wanting and continuing it to have it in her body, that may also be contingent on her lifestyle factors. They're not controlling her body while she continues to have that baby, given it was an obligation that she never bore. But moreover, these guys wanted to say that you have an obligation to future people. That's simply not the case when we're talking about, say, the obligations to future generations, in the case of, say, like environmental damage. Because we can't value the kinds of harm that come to not yet existent people, to people whose lives are uncertain, to people whose value either as a disabled person is still a value in comparison to non-existence. That's why this was entirely different. But secondly, to the level of why this was different to abuse. This was fundamentally a different scenario of motivation, in that the level of human cruelty that exists when you say hear a child crying out because they are hungry is entirely absent in this scenario. It is like a random thing that is sucking off you when you're most vulnerable. The reason we apply criminal sanctions in those cases is because it is the absolute violation of the parent-child relationship, of trust. That yet human element of violation does not yet exist when that baby is still in utero, when the woman herself is struggling. But finally, to the extent that they wanted to say it was all analogous, that didn't play out in their model, which was one of community service, apparently, which didn't treat the damage to a fetus in the same way to damage later on in life. And that's why it was profoundly unfair. The reason we know that a woman has rights to take some risks with her fetus because of her own bodily autonomy is seen when we let women do things like, and rightly let them do things like, inducing early labour because they have preeclampsia that threatens their own bodily autonomy, when they're allowed to take morning sickness pills which may damage their baby, but is ultimately ruining their entire lives. This is all born out of the conflict that is entirely different when you're talking about a living, breathing woman who just does not have the right to have all of her lifestyle decisions impeded upon because she is carrying a fetus and whose existence is contingent on her wanting to carry that fetus in the circumstances that she wishes to do so. But secondly, to the element of women, these have been strikingly absent of the affirmative team's case, even though they are actual living existent people who are being harmed in this case. These guys wanted to say they're going to seek community help. Why would you now, when you're being targeted as a criminal and an abuser, instead of a person that is struggling with their own personal health conflicts? Why would you seek medical treatment for your own obviously serious medical health issues if you are someone who has, say, for example, an alcoholic, which is the only circumstance like those severe levels that lead to fetal alcohol syndrome? Why would you seek your own and prioritize your own health interests when that is going to lead you facing criminal sanction? Ladies and gentlemen, this damaged the women in these particular cases, but it damaged them to the extent that abortion rights were threatened, that it continues to begin to say things like women don't have the right to ownership over their body and anything that can be invaded upon simply because it may damage a yet non-existent person. This damaged women, but particularly it targeted the most vulnerable women. So to the extent that you wanted to make a point about cigarette companies, these weren't the women we were talking about. Most women cared about having a healthy pregnancy. It was the ones that couldn't stop. And I didn't see the use in this debate of targeting an alcoholic woman, like the person that's going to give their kid fetal alcohol syndrome, and targeting him as a criminal instead of the healthcare and support that that person needs. We need to consider what is best and where criminal sanctions should be applied, and these are not the women that deserve it. It wasn't the 14-year-old crack addict in Louisiana. So I'm going to tell you about, firstly, the perceptions and support this gives to children who have disabilities, and secondly, how this leads to unfair, arbitrary punishments. So firstly, the problem with the affirmative team's case is that it says that disability is the result of negligent parenting. And the problem with that is that it accrues not only to people who come from pregnancies involved in this, but to all people whose disabilities may come from simply genetic differences. It says that disability is something that we not only can prevent, but that we should be preventing in every single circumstance. The problem with that is it fundamentally changes the way that's supported, because it's not a long-term issue that will always exist as a difference in our society. It is one that we can stop as soon as we get rid of the irresponsible mothers. That has profound impacts for the level of support that disabled people in our community get. The first is that the pleas for support for communities are going to fall on deaf ears, given that it is often the mothers, the carers that ask their governments for adequate support, and those disabled children can't do it for themselves. Taking those women out as criminals and as abusive is absolutely the worst thing you could do for disabled children. If you cared about them in this debate, you wouldn't be labelling their carers as criminals. But secondly, to the extent that this means that the state starts labelling disabilities, even those caused by lifestyle factors, as the personal failings of a family, it takes away from the obligation the state had to, say, for example, preventing 14-year-olds from being addicted to crack cocaine, from preventing, say, the kinds of lack of support that led to people trying to kill themselves when they were pregnant. These were the kinds of harms that the state had an obligation to. So if you wanted to protect children with disabilities, you did the exact opposite by stigmatizing and taking away the support of those kids that will always exist and do exist. But secondly, this leads to unfair and arbitrary punishments based on sensitivity periods, whereby different chemicals and the different developmental stages of fetus leads to vastly different outcomes, vastly different motivations, and therefore entirely arbitrary punishments. The difference here is that you're often dealing with uneducated and vulnerable women who we cannot reasonably expect to be aware of those varieties of limitations. So because having a fetus in situ did not allow the state to invade your privacy, invade your rights, and consider you to not be a person, we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, Nina. Now for the last substantive speaker on the side affirmative, Nick Cross.
The rhetoric and moral complaints of the negative team ignores the fact that there are real people who have been damaged by illnesses like fetal alcohol syndrome. There may be people in this room who suffer symptoms. There may be people in your community. There may be people in the city. Overall in the world, there are millions of people who suffer this very debilitating disease that is very easily prevented by simply not consuming these substances. We're the team that helps those people in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we think we're able to win. Right. 2 questions. The first is this a moral policy? I'm going to deal with the 5 main objections in the negative team in this debate and show why they don't stand up. The second one is, do we help women here, and in particular, do we help children? We think that children are the most important stakeholder in this debate, whether or not they are currently persons when they're in the room. Right, 5 moral questions that they asked. The first one was, is fetal alcohol syndrome or smoking-related diseases caused during pregnancy a sufficient harm? And they wanted to compare this to obesity here. They said, look, if you made your children really, really fat, they wouldn't necessarily criminalize you for that. The first thing we would say is that perhaps we would. Perhaps if you made your child really, really morbidly obese by severely malnourishing them with McDonald's and KFC every day, that should be covered by the sort of laws which cover negligent parenting, right? But the obvious answer is that the sort of harms we're talking about in terms of fetal alcohol syndrome are analogous to the sort of things that can happen if you beat your child, if you maim their limbs, because that's the sort of things that can happen. We absolutely would criminalize that, and that's why we only have to show that the harm is morally relevant here, right? So it's not enough to say that the harms aren't great enough, because clearly when we're talking about these sort of diseases, they are. The second thing they said was, look, people are just going to get abortions. And maybe on the margins, a few more people will be incentivized to get abortions because they know they don't want to face this criminal sanction. We're fine with that, and here's why. We've accepted all throughout this debate that an unborn child, or at least one definitely in the early mid stages of pregnancy, does not have personhood and does not have rights. We do not call the fact that in our societies, tens of thousands of people are aborted every year a genocide or a mass murder, right? That's because they're not persons. So we think if they are aborted at that stage, it's fine. It's not a moral crime. What we're talking about is the people who will become persons and the harms to them. And the key to this debate is that we have been able to make that distinction. We have been able to say that is a morally relevant harm. Right, the third thing is it morally relevant here that they are currently not a person? Now, I want to pose a question to you. Suppose that I entered into a tomb which had not been yet discovered, and I knew that that tomb would not be entered into by another person who was currently alive today. Maybe it would in future, but not by someone who is currently alive. Suppose I planted a booby trap in that tomb, which I know would severely maim or cause severe brain damage to the next person who entered it. Is it no longer an immoral act because that person is not alive? We say absolutely not, and that's ridiculous, right? They said, look, this is too wide a principle. They said, look, we don't want to criminalize generic harms to the community, people who you couldn't foresee, future generations, right? The difference is there is a directly foreseeable entity who will become a person who is harmed here. We agree. We're not going to criminalize the harms to the grandchildren of the person with fetal alcohol syndrome, even though they may suffer harms. We're criminalizing the direct harm, right? That's what the law in this area tends to focus on. Directness, foreseeability. We think the risk here is entirely foreseeable, and we're quite happy to stand on those sort of consequentialist grounds. The fourth thing they said here is, where do you draw the line? And we're quite happy to draw the line in a number of ways, right? The first is that fetal alcohol syndrome is extremely well known, and it is not a socially acceptable, normal thing, something you do during pregnancy, like taking painkillers, that you drink lots and lots of alcohol. And that's what causes fetal alcohol syndrome. We're happy to just draw the distinction there. But the second thing is the concept of unreasonable risks, because we think in terms of recklessness, our law does look at what is and is not an unreasonable risk. If you take a reasonable risk, like for example, taking painkillers during pregnancy, and that in the very likely instance that results in harms to the fetus, we're happy to say, look, that risk was reasonable at the time, so we're not going to penalize you for taking it. But having smoking and drinking excessively during your pregnancy is in no way a reasonable risk, right? That's a concept that already exists in the law. We're happy to implement in this case. Finally, they talked about women, and they said, you haven't considered the harms to the women who exist in this debate. And we said, absolutely. We agree that women should have lots and lots of rights over their bodies, and that's the primary justification for why we have abortion laws which legalize abortion. But we do recognize that where a person is going to be born into the world, there is a duty to that person. Mothers have a duty, right? And we think that duty is reasonable. What do we say, furthermore, in terms of the harm that is being incurred here? We're essentially saying you cannot smoke and drink excessively, right? That's something that is already being cracked down upon by most governments, right? In New Zealand and Australia, apparently smoking is going to be illegal by 2025. By their logic, that's got to be a mass harm to every person's individual rights in those circumstances. Quite happy to stand up in this debate and say that it is not, a really, really unreasonable harm to these people that they can't smoke and drink. In particular, in terms of illegal drugs, in terms of crack cocaine babies, that's already illegal, right? Finally, they said, look, this sends the message that having a disability is bad and that harms people with all sorts of disabilities in society. But hold on, right? There are all sorts of ways you can get disabilities through deliberate actions of your parents that we do already criminalize. Take, for example, if you beat your child and that resulted in them getting a disability which they had for life. We wouldn't not criminalize the parent who beat that child and caused that disability because that might have some sort of wider harm to people with disabilities. We don't accept that they were able to show any sort of ground on this point. Right, next point is in terms of the sort of practical level of this debate. Right, they asked, is this penalty going to be too severe, or is it going to be, not achieve anything? Clearly, Paul wasn't listening to our speech because we talked about the sort of medium-level punishments that we're happy to impose in this debate. We're happy to impose large community sentence, which involve, apologising to the community. We're happy to involve community service. We're happy to involve large stays in rehab for these people, right? We think those are the sort of punishments which are going to be effective deterrents and are going to tell people and send the right message, but are not going to, send a woman to jail and turn her into a criminal. They're not going to split people up from their children to such a large extent that that's a harm, right? Furthermore, they said that people are going to avoid the medical system as a result of this. Like, are you kidding? People are not going to avoid the medical system as a whole. And we think it's extremely hard to hide your child from the world to such a long period of time that the fetal alcohol syndrome will never be diagnosed and you'll never get caught for this, right? First of all, people get birth certificates in most of these countries. We think the authorities are very strenuous about ensuring that they keep records as to who is born and who isn't. We simply don't think it's reasonable to say that you're going to be able to hide the fact that your child has fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a lifelong condition, and always get away with that, right? Finally, let's talk about the benefits in this debate. This is where they have never responded, because they've accepted all down the line that we get the sort of benefits we wanted to talk about. We talked about the signalling mechanism criminal law. We talked about how when a criminal sanction is imposed, people sit up and take notice. We talked about how this raises the profile of this in the media. When the first people go through the courts and the community is forced to do some sort of soul searching, is forced to actually confront the fact that people are drinking and smoking excessively when people are pregnant. We told you how the industry will respond. We told you that they are going to get a bad rep as a result of this undermining their narrative about choice and the harms from alcohol and from smoking being a choice which people incur. That's going to mean large advertising campaigns. That's going to mean bigger warning labels on alcohol packets. All of these get the benefit that we want. That benefit is less fetal alcohol syndrome, which significantly destroys the quality of life of real people we propose.
Thanks, Nick. And now for the last substantive speaker of this debate, Daniel Swain.
Ladies and gentlemen, apparently this was a proposal that would deter women from drinking and smoking, but not deter them from seeking assistance when they drank and they smoked. It was one that had an important social discursive impact around drinking and smoking during pregnancy, but apparently didn't negatively affect the discourses around women's bodily autonomy or the nature of disability. It was a policy in this debate that said that if you drink and your child gets a disability, you caused that. But if you were a healthy mother that just didn't abort the disabled child, you didn't cause that. Even though in both cases, that's a woman with full knowledge acting on a potential life based on her decisions about her body. The first thing I'm going to look at is whether this is a just law. Second of all, the impact of the law, and finally, social perception. So first of all, whether this is a just law. We said in this debate that we don't consider the harm to potential life a harm that can be criminal. They said the difference between this and future generations is the birth of that life is directly foreseeable. We said the state and prosecutors aren't psychic and can't know the intentions of the way that woman intends to manage that pregnancy over the course of her pregnancy. So she might smoke in the first trimester thinking that she's not sure whether she wants to have that child and may not want to have that child. That will be a pretty persuasive argument in court. The reason I was drinking is I didn't intend to have it. They couldn't prove that intention to directly foreseeably create that life. But also we thought this was a silly standard, that we thought that the harm had to happen to the child at the point it was a legal person. And in this case, that wasn't happening. It was happening at the point where that side didn't feel it was someone that had any claim to rights. And when that mother could know that maybe she might miscarriage, she doesn't know necessarily that child is going to be born. Just like we don't know necessarily the harms of global warming to future generations, we can only speculate. That it was relevant in this debate that they thought that abortion was legal, because perversely then, under their system, the state punishes you for partially reducing the ability of your child to experience happiness, but not for totally reducing the possibility of that child to experience happiness. That it's true that this child then is never born, but at the point where they were going to make generous assumptions about the likelihood of that child being born, why wouldn't you make that generous assumptions about, say, either you didn't go to the abortion, it's very likely that child would have been born. It's very likely that child would have come into being, that the kind of risks and probabilities they wanted to talk about were asymmetric. And the harm of that is that made this law profoundly unjust. But also, the standard they wanted to set in this debate of why this was necessarily something criminal is that a woman was informed, that a woman made a choice about her body, and that caused a disability for that child that was serious and demonstrable. We said that that applied to a number of other decisions that women could make. that actually, when you're thinking about a mother that chooses a particular birthing practice, they're even more certain and even a greater intention that child is born than a mother that's recklessly drinking. And they're imposing certain risks on that child and the greater likelihood that child will be disabled, knowing that child will come into the world. And the problem with this is that the women that have the hydropathic home births are from the upper middle class and your policy doesn't affect them. But the poor women who drink, the most vulnerable in the society, is the choices of the mothers that you're targeting. We also explained in this debate that insofar as this mother was harming this child, that the relevant potential, which they didn't respond to with Paul's argument, is all of that potential created the possibility of that child ever experiencing any happiness, that all the service the mother did to that child we think was relevant in this debate. And it's what distinguished it from poisoning a child that was alive at that particular point, who someone else could raise, who the state could take into care. This was a child that was totally produced in terms of identity and its life from you. So, having established this is a profoundly inconsistent law based on vague standards of causation and vague standards of intent and vague standards of how we can know that a life will come about, we now need to move on to the impact of this law. Because we challenged them that there was a number of instances where mothers' decisions weren't traceable to the baby that was then born. They said, fine, we'll contract this debate to cases like crack babies and fetal alcohol syndrome. That was relevant because when Asha started this debate, this was a pervasive social problem, as opposed to the very few cases of crack babies and fetal alcohol syndrome that we see. But it also changed the types of incentives that the mother they were trying to affect in this debate, or the pregnant woman, because she's not a mother, in this debate. We think that these were groups that already had laws telling them their choices were bad. Like the crack-addicted mother's already breaking a law in that country and didn't find that legal system sufficiently persuasive to change her decision. That the first world states they talked about already had the part of their model that informed these mothers that being an alcoholic was bad, and that wasn't necessarily changing their behavior at this particular point in time. But we said, if your law is persuasive enough to pass judgment on these women and force them to stop drinking when they already can see the benefits of not drinking, like alcoholism is not something socially productive, these women are addicted, we think that it will also deter them from taking reasonable steps to protect their own safety, especially because these women are irrational. They're unlikely to make the predictive distinctions of the third affirmative speaker about the fact that they'll know eventually due to hospital records, but also because they don't necessarily know that their drinking is going to lead to that child being harmed later on, whereas at the point they need to seek out that health service, they're providing evidence at that particular point that fetal alcohol syndrome caused this child, because fetal alcohol syndrome and the consequences of that can be caused by other things, and doctors disagree about whether you can specifically diagnose that it was that mother's drinking at that particular point that caused it, but also that their punishment of a community service was a huge concession in this debate, or a community sentence, because it conceded they didn't view this as the same as poisoning your child. Well, we would not give you a community sentence. That they didn't consider this the same as the harm that actually accrues to a life. They maintained the distinction that was the premise of the law that the negative team stood by in this debate. This was not an analogous social harm in this particular debate. So let's bring on to social perceptions, because that very small group we're talking about in this debate, leading to a very small harm to babies that would not otherwise be born, has to be weighed against the huge social harms of the discursive effects this policy produces to disabled people and vulnerable women. So first I want to address the contingent nature of Asher's material. He said this was important informationally, that it sent a message about society's preferences and values. The reason that's contingent is you have to prove it's a worthy law, because we wouldn't just apply community sentences to women to send a message. Like, if we've won the first issue in this debate, the idea of channeling community views doesn't apply, because those views have to first be proved to be correct. What will happen? And that's why it was wrong for this side to say there's no harms to abortion to people alive today, because Nina's substantive material relevantly told you there were harms to abortion. It said that disabled children's lives weren't worth living. The opposition said, well, when parents disable living children, that doesn't send a message that disability is bad. But the precise message of your model, in fact, the concession of the third affirmative speaker that they would be fine with abortions of disabled children, is that the lives of disabled people are not worth living. And that accrues to a much greater stakeholder than just the very specific things that Jody narrowed this debate to at that particular point in time. That it says to women everywhere, the majority of women who aren't alcoholics or addicted to crack, that the state views your body and your uterus as a zone of public policy. It regulates for its own interest because ultimately you should have known, and the implications they can impose on you are something they can then put community sanction on. The way that includes all kinds of social justice. We didn't think in this debate that smoking companies were currently wanted to or were encouraging women to smoke. We think there were already serious social judgments against firms and individuals saying to these women, don't make those choices. The difference here is the woman who wants to just enjoy one glass of wine, now every time she feels that need to be different or separate from her baby, the state drags her back and reminds her that ultimately it has a responsibility to regulate her in the interest of that child. This was a law that was inconsistent, applied to a very narrow group, but warped our perceptions about what bodies meant, what children meant to society, and also the social impact of being a mother we were very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Daniel. Now for the reply speaker from the side negative, Paul Cobb.
The harm the affirmative model caused was the potential that was being destroyed by abortion. It was to disable people who were told that their lives weren't worth living because that is a sufficient harm to justify the use of the criminal law. And it was to the women who weren't able to control their bodies because community standards was now the justification for taking away their bodily autonomy. Let's look at the two issues of the debate. Firstly, the balance of rights, and secondly, the effectiveness of the model. Firstly, on the balance of rights. The affirmative told us that you don't have an unfettered right to treat your children as you like. We told you that the fetuses are not yet people. The affirmative said that it was sufficient in this debate that the fetuses would in future be a person. We were able to show you that they're not necessarily going to become people, that anything could happen in the meantime, like a miscarriage, so that this model was in fact punishing an intention to cause harm to a future person that may never come into existence. We then showed you the other case, the more likely case, is that you would have an incentive then to get an abortion to prevent that person ever coming to existence in a way that would make you criminally liable. Their response in this debate at second was to say that there was no harm to that because if the fetus was never born, then there just couldn't be any harm. We brought you two compelling harms. The first was the message that some lives are not worth living, because while some people will be aborted for this, we showed you that other people born with disability in society are now harmed by an affirmative model that says that that was a sufficient harm and a sufficiently suboptimal life to justify the use of the criminal law. That was disgusting. The second harm we brought you was my material about why it might be better for them to exist, to be brought into existence. And it was never clear in this debate why the affirmative would incentivize, in an attempt to consider decreasing the potential benefit of someone's life, were prepared to obliterate the potential for that life altogether. And that if they were prepared to consider the harm to the fetus now of living a suboptimal life in the future, then why not the potential benefit to existing of someone in the future who would otherwise be aborted as a consequence of this model? Secondly, in the balance of rights, we told you that they'd never shown that living with a disability was bad enough to justify criminal law. We think it was largely conceded by their case by the piss weak model of community service as so light that that is absolutely not analogous to how we treat people that are abusive to their children or that inflict a disability on a real life person. We think this indicated it was not a sufficient harm. They didn't really believe in this standard. Last thing in this issue is we brought you substantive material about why this would tend to overreach, that the same logic they used to justify for fetal alcohol syndrome would justify infringing in lots of decisions of women. The response was that only some things cause harm. No, everything might cause harm. It's just a matter of the extent and probability of that. The problem was that the affirmative in this debate had set up community standards as being sufficient for determining what that harm was and when that was good enough, but never wanted to defend the consequence of that community standards could take all the other options away from women that we brought you in our case. Second issue, effectiveness of model. They said we would prosecute. How would they prove it if a woman could claim that they would just have aborted the fetus? Also, the genetic argument, in fact, limited their model to only application to fetal alcohol syndrome in this debate. Lastly, they never responded to analysis at first that if parents weren't deterred from the risk of having their children taken away by abuse when they were born, why would they be deterred about this model, which has a much lower penalty? Next, they said, oh, but messaging covers it all. Oh, we'll get the message from it. Well, people are already shamed pretty comprehensively. We told you that at the start of the debate. But they were never able to resolve the tension that why that shame was sufficient to stop, to make people act as they said, but not sufficiently strong enough to stop women having simple pleasures of a glass of alcohol now and again, or to get help for their addiction. So because we think that this model did overreach and control women's bodies, and because it harmed real people and potential, we opposed.
Thank you, Paul. Now for the last speaker, the reply speaker of the side affirmative, Asher Manuel.
When a child is born with fetal alcohol syndrome, when it's born with that disability, that happened because the mother let it happen. If this House refuses to implement this policy, that kind of thing will happen because we, as a community, let it happen. There's two questions in this reply. Firstly, we're going to be looking at practically who defends against the harm and comparing two different worlds and looking at kind of the case of quibbles that we heard from that side of the House. And then secondly, we're going to be looking at this extraneous material about how it affects the discourse. So firstly, who limits the number of children who have to live a life suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome or the various attendant disabilities? What was their world? Well, at Nina was the closest thing you heard to a countermodel, right? It was, we want these women to get the help and support that we need. But they never gave you a conception of a world which was making any progress at reversing this trend or doing anything at all other than sticking like tiny warning labels on the back of beer cans, Mr. Speaker. That was no way forward. What did we propose on this side of the House? We gave you a number of mechanisms, none of which were substantially challenged. We told you about how this changes the calculus for an individual, right? The one response for that came at third, where Swain was like, well, there's crack babies, which are still crack babies, even though that's currently illegal. But that's why they missed the entire community standards analysis, that we affect people's decision-making when we say that that particular choice to consume that problematic substance doesn't just affect you, but it affects the other person. And they gave you no reason to believe that messaging is not at all effective. There was no analytical framework behind the idea that people do not take some kind of cue from the law, or do not take some kind of cue from what the rest of community thinks as acceptable at all. Nor was there any kind of challenge to the idea that it affects the way in which an alcohol industry celebrates the idea of choice. All of that material that came out at NIC, that an industry which says the choice is yours, the harm should be accepted by you, this undercuts that narrative. And we don't accept this characterization of these individuals as entirely irrational, because these mechanisms do change people's decisions. That's why we have criminal law. That's why we expect it to change people's behavior and have the community enforce those standards. What were their quibbles? A whole bunch of stuff about how this was not a legal person, that there were issues with the burden of proof, and that the justice system can't superintend this process all of the long way, right? Purity of the criminal law for purity of the criminal law's sake makes no sense at all, Mr. Speaker. And we were happy that there was a burden of proof, right? Because it creates the risk, and it means that those who did not do this to their child will not be caught. The next main issue was this idea that we were compelling people to have abortions. And we said that that was actually incoherent with their case if they were so concerned about the idea of this person coming into the world, but they didn't care about the idea that that person would come into the world at the option of having a disability which they did not otherwise need to have. Next came the idea that what you're choosing is entirely legitimate, because you can choose to take a morning sickness pill, you can choose to have a water birth, and the like. That missed the analysis. There was no response at Swain to the idea of a reasonable risk in criminal law, the kind of things that you choose to do at your own option. We think that if those kind of things reach the standard of this kind of certain harm to a child and minimal benefit to the mother, like having some drinks, we would criminalize those things as well, Mr. Speaker. They don't, so we don't. Community sentence insufficient, right? We set the sanction to the standard that works, not the sanction which fulfills our moral beliefs. As to this idea of individuals bleeding out on the streets, they dropped that at first because it was the alarmism in the last 4 minutes of their first negative. And the idea that this was a huge limitation on rights was nonsense. It's a choice of drinking and smoking. discourse affects. We told you it affects good things, and it has a positive effect on the way in which people decide that parents should be treating their children. And we think there's an intuitive distinction between disabled children who come about as a result of genetic disabilities and disabled children who are a result of a person's option at their own choice. Imagine two babies, Mr. Speaker, one of which is already disabled, one of which is not. They're both in utero. In one situation, the mother makes a choice that disadvantages that person into the future. That's a distinction which we think that the audience and we think everybody in the world can understand. That's why this policy is not going to communicate something to the contrary. As to this notion that we are disrespecting women's bodies, we still respect their right to not have to carry a child to term if they do not want to. The thing is, once you do make that decision, that you are going to give birth to another person, that you are going to take the responsibility and care for that person, if you take unreasonable risks and place your own pleasure over their future, we're willing to intervene, Mr. Speaker. They stand by, we intervene.
Thanks, both teams. I would like to invite the adjudicators to a room to make the decisions.